Hello and welcome to another video. For those of you who don't know, I'm Wayne. I'm the founder of nocodecreative.io. We help businesses automate systems, integrate systems with AI, and we develop low-code applications with tools like n8n, Flutterflow, and a range of other tools. Today, we are going to be having a look at webhooks within n8n. This video is actually inspired by some work that we did for a client recently. We were asked to audit their current n8n setup where they had some business users creating workflows. And the first thing that we noticed in their setup is that none of their webhooks had any security on them at all. So yes, it inspired me to create a video about webhooks and how to make sure they're secure, which is what we'll be covering today. So what is a webhook in n8n? Well, it's essentially an endpoint that n8n exposes to trigger workflows when called. You can send data to it, so query parameters, headers. You can send JSON to it in body or forms, and it can respond immediately, or it can respond at any point during your workflow back to the application that's calling it. Each webhook gives you a URL. It actually gives you two URLs, one for testing with and one for production use. And security is also built into webhooks as well. You have various options to choose the kind of security that you want to use with that webhook. And then you have some advanced options as well, such as CORS and IP address whitelisting, which we'll cover today. Okay, so for this tutorial, we will be using Supabase. I will leave a link in the comments to a blog post that you can follow along with for this tutorial, and it will include a SQL script so that you can create this table with some test data if you want to follow along with the tutorial. Once you sign up for a free Supabase account, you'll be able to grab this SQL, come over to the SQL editor, and simply copy and paste it in, and then run the script, and it will create the table for you. Okay, so let's talk about the different methods that are available when calling your webhook within n8n. So we have get, which is used for getting data normally. We have a post request, which is used for inserting data. Patch, which is normally used for updating. Delete, self-explanatory. Head is a bit less common, but it's used to check headers. And then put is for replacing order data within a row, for example. So replacing a whole resource with new data, but potentially keeping the ID. So if we look at get first of all, and if we, as I mentioned previously, there's two URLs to trigger a webhook within n8n. We have got a test URL and we've got a production URL as well. So we're going to start with the test URL. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to use a tool called Postman, which is used for testing webhooks and APIs. We're going to copy, I've already copied this webhook into Postman to get data, and I've put a query parameter at the end. So a query parameter is a way of extending the URL with filters, which you may want to use when filtering your data source. So this takes the form of a question mark, and then we have the key, which is the email, and then we have the value thereafter. And you can see this down here. So email under parameters, email, and then we have the value down here as well. And this corresponds to a record that we have within Supabase. So I have a table for demo contacts, and then we have a record here for Charlie Lee with his email address. So we're going to filter and return this record. So the differences between the test webhook and the production one, well, the test webhook is only going to trigger the webhook node and no subsequent nodes thereafter, but it's a good opportunity to get data into the workflow so that you can then work with that and sort out the rest of your logic. So to use the test webhook, you need to make sure it's active and listening. So you can say listen for test events, and then we can test that out. I can send this. Nothing's going to be returned to Postman on this occasion because it is a test, but we can see within n8n that we have our query parameter, which is charlie@example.com, which is exactly what we sent from Postman. So now I can pin this data so we can keep it and use it. I have then inserted a Supabase node. The operation is set to get a row from the demo contacts table, and we're going to filter by the email column, and we are going to map the incoming query parameter to this email column here. And then when we press execute, we can see the data from the database is being returned back into n8n. And then we can then use this for subsequent operations, or we could return that information back to our calling application, which in this case is Postman. Now, if I used a production URL, so to use the production URL, the workflow does need to be active. And we can come over to Postman, remove the test line, press send, and we can see the data at this time was actually returned to Postman. And that is happening because we have a respond to Webhook node. So if we have a look at the previous execution, we can see that it's used the respond to Webhook node, which we have set to all incoming items, and it's returned this one item back to Postman. If there were multiple rows that we had returned, for example, if you were to query by maybe a name and there were multiple contacts with the same name, it may return multiple objects from the database, and therefore all incoming items would return every single object that came from the Supabase node. You can change this. There is options to tweak what you actually want to have returned. Okay, next we have a post request. So we simply have set the HTTP method to post. And I should mention, you don't actually need to use separate webhook nodes for each method. You can come over to the settings here and you can say allow multiple methods, which will then give you a multi-select here. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to leave it as is. So we are going to insert data this time. So we're going to use a post request to do that. And that then allows us to send a body, a JSON body, into our workflow, which is then going to be used to create a row. So if we come back over to Postman, we can see what that looks like. So we have a post request to insert data. And then within the body, we have put some JSON in here. And we're going to insert johnfree@example.com. Let's make sure he's not already there. He's not. Great. And this time, we should be able to see this working from beginning to end. Okay, so you can see it's inserted a new row. And we know that because it's returned a new ID, which is incremented from the previous ID. And if we have a look over here at Supabase, we should be able to see there's a new row now in the table. Now, let's just have a look at what's actually went on here. So the first thing to note is in the webhook, we can see that because it's a post request, the data has actually came in the body of the webhook. So it's nested within an object called body, and there's a number of key value pairs within this object. Now, if we try to insert that directly into Supabase, it would fail because it's in the key of body, in the body object. So what we've done within our workflow is we've used a set node just to flatten this out. So within the set node, we've set the mode to JSON, and we've said JSON body just by dragging this across to here, and then we can see the output is then flattened. And this is because in our Supabase node, we have got it set to auto map input data to columns. So it needs to be an exact match of what Supabase expects. And if we just try to insert it as body, they'd be nested, so it wouldn't work. Okay, so and also as well, because it's a create operation, we've told it to ignore the ID. You could insert an ID, but in this case, we have got Supabase set up to auto increment the ID within the ID column, so that's not required. And then we are sending that data back into Postman the same as we did with our GET request. So next we are going to look at patch, which is for updating records. Similar setup to as we had previously. This time node, the Supabase node, is going to be set to update, and we are going to update by matching the incoming ID. And then we're going to auto map the incoming data as we did before. So what that looks like in Postman, or the application that would be sending data. If we look at our patch here, we see ID 1. We can see that we've got a name here. Just have a look at the database. In fact, this one doesn't exist. So let's just change this to ID 2. And then we can send this request. And we can see ID 2 has now been updated. If you look over here in Supabase, Bob Smith is now Alice Johnson 99. So that is how we use a patch. Next is deletes. Very self-explanatory. We're going to use our delete request here, and we're going to delete purely based on the ID. So if I send this across, let's just have a look, because we have an error. Get the production URL. Back in here. ID 2. And then we can see the workflow started because there's no respond on this. We've set this to Webhook to respond immediately. So it doesn't need a respond to Webhook. No, we'll just respond with a status code, in this case of 200, to say it's been successful. And you can see on the previous run that our Supabase node has used the ID2 to delete the record from the database, which no longer exists. And next we have head. As I mentioned before, this will just return the headers. It's not very commonly used. And put to return to update all of the information of a resource, which is technically what we've just done with patch, but you should use put for that if you're doing things properly. Okay, now you may have noticed that for every single one of these webhooks, I don't have any authentication set whatsoever, which if a workflow is active, leaves it ripe for exposure, for hackers, for anything that wants to try and interact with your data. It can be done. These are open. They will not get rejected at all. So we want to make sure that every single one of these webhooks has some kind of authentication to prevent malicious actors trying to use them. And we've got a few different types of authentication that are commonly used. We're going to look at basic auth, header auth, and JWT, JSON Web Token. So if, for example, I look at our GET request, as you've seen earlier, it works, no problem at all. If I then come to authentication, basic auth, now within n8n, you are able to create a credential, and that basic auth is simply a username and a password. Okay, so if I enable that, hit save, come back over to Postman, and if I then use our try and get data from here, if I actually turn off, let's put this back to no authentication, press send, and now you can see it doesn't work because we have authorization is required being returned, which is exactly what we want. Now, to fix that, we would change the authentication type to basic auth and make sure that our username and password is inserted. That's what happened with the platform. Whatever software you're using to call that webhook, it would send this information to make sure that you can authenticate and return the data that you want. The next type of authentication is header auth. Very, very commonly used. In this case, if I come down to header auth and I set this up for our header auth account, we can see that we've set the parameter. So that's the header key to XAPI key. And then we've put the value in here, which is the password as well. You will commonly see header auth being referred to as something called bearer, a bearer token. And in that case, the name would be authorization, and you would simply insert bearer with a capital P and a space before whatever the token is or the value. So it's very commonly used, and you'll definitely come across that. But for this one, API key in the header auth, head back over to Postman, got our post request, turn our authorization off, and again, you'll now see it's going to be rejected. If I turn authorization back on to our bearer, where were we? API key, X API key with the value in here and location in the header. It's now going to work. It hasn't returned anything, but it hasn't rejected our request. It hasn't returned anything probably because it's given us an error to say that the record already exists within Supabase. But we can see it is working and allowed it through, whereas there's no request here for the previous ones. So we're using X API key as the key. We have a value and we're locating it in the header. As I mentioned previously, you'll also see bearer token, which is essentially the same thing. But bearer token, what's actually happening is we're just sending a header, which is automatically set to authorization, and we're simply inserting, as I say, the word bearer, the capital B and a space in front of what the value is. And that's essentially what a bearer token is. Okay, so the next type of authentication that we're going to look at is JWT, Auth, also known as JSON Web Tokens. What this does, so if you can imagine you're in an application and you sign into your application with your username and password, the back end of that application generates a token. And this token is an encoded string, and it contains IDs of the user, permissions, and it also contains things like an expiry date and time as well. And the back end of the application hands that back to the user interface, the front end of the application. And every time the application does something that needs to call the backend to retrieve data, to change something in the database, it checks that web token to make sure it's valid, so it hasn't expired, and it makes sure that it correlates to a user on the database. It knows who they are and it knows the permissions that that user has. So it attaches that every time it makes a request. It's basically the same as a bearer token that I spoke about previously. So you have a header, authorization, bearer, and then the JSON web token, which then authenticates. Okay, so if we have a look at our patch webhook within n8n, we can see it's set to JWT auth, and I've set a credential here, which I've created. Passphrase, we have a secret, which we have got from Supabase, and then we have an algorithm, which is the algorithm that's been used to encode the secret. If I have a look at Supabase, if we come to JWT keys, and we have our JWT secret here, which I've copied and pasted into Supabase. So it's common across both Supabase and n8n. So we can then use this to decrypt the incoming web token and make sure that the user is correct and authorized to access the data. Now, to get the token, we are going to mimic what would typically happen at the front end of your application after you've logged in. It would generally send a request to Supabase with a query parameter for grant password, and we would send body here with the user and the user's passwords. We would also have authorization for the API. So in this case, API key with a value placed in the header. And then once we run this, we can see it actually returns all the information about the user. Don't worry, I'm going to change this password afterwards. But then, we can see that we have our access token. We can see the token type. We can see when it expires. You see all the information about the user, the fact that they're authenticated. So we've got all the details that we need to ensure that that user is doing what they're supposed to be able to do when accessing the system. So if I grab the access token here, so we're going to grab our token. We're going to come over to the patch request, which we just added the JWT auth to. If I just put some random data in here, we've changed this to bearer token, and hit send, it's going to say that the JWT is malformed. So that is the response that the user would get if they weren't authenticated with the application that's calling the backend. But with the correct token, nothing was returned, which is what we expect because it was allowed through, and the patch isn't returning anything to our application, in this case, Postman. So if we have a look at our executions, if we have a look at this one that we just sent, we can actually see the same information that we just seen in Postman. So we can see the JWT payload, authenticated, who the user is, and then the other information that's available. So in your workflow, you could then use this information to, filter what's being returned based on the authenticated user. So within n8n, that is the 3 primary authentication types that are available. You will see some applications have different types of authentication, which may require a code node to validate something coming in return, but that's probably out of the scope for this video. There are a few other things that you can do to make sure that your webhooks are even more secure. So if we have a look at the webhook here, and if we have a look at our options, you can see we have a couple of different options here. So allowed origins, cause, which is normally set to star, which means allow anything. But say, for example, you had an application, Supabase is an application that sits on supabase.com, and you only wanted to allow requests to come from that domain, you would add your supabase.com domain into this core setting here. So it's a way of locking it down to where the front end of your application lives, effectively. You can also do a IP address whitelist. So, if you know, for example, if you're developing something locally and you maybe want to send that data into the cloud, and where n8n lives, if you're using cloud n8n, you could restrict the webhook to only work from your local IP address. And then we have a few other options, such as ignore bots as well. So plenty of options there to make sure that things are secure. But yes, you should never, ever leave a webhook unsecure. So please do make sure that you secure them with one of these methods. Response types, we've kind of touched on it as well. So we have immediately, which returns a 200 code with no data. When last webhook node finishes, which will always be at the end of the workflow. And then we have our respond to webhook node as well, which you can set at any point in your workflow, which can be very, very handy. And of course, we also have our new streaming response type within n8n, which is used to stream AI messages back to a chat interface, for example, which is something that I'll cover in a bit more detail in another upcoming tutorial. So watch this space for that. But yes, I hope this has been useful. Hopefully you now understand a bit more about how webhooks work within n8n and understand how to secure them. So thank you very much for watching. If you liked this and found it useful, please like, please subscribe, you know the drill. And I shall see you in the next one. Thank you.